Holding on page 10, that's the fourth page of the Maimer. Ois Hey, we were speaking about earlier in the Maimer, be able to understand the idea of the Baruch B'Koyanim, which is very speedy and very quick, comes down. Be able to understand that and uniqueness. That's why it was Vayig Moshkedim, it blossomed the almonds because they're very quick to indicate the speed of the Baruch B'Koyanim. And to be able to understand it, we start explaining what we are accomplishing every day by davening. When it was already determined, Rosh and Kippur, what we're going to have as far as Parnasa, Bona, Chaim, Zoina, etc. So the explanation was that the way it's decided on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur is that Chesed of Atzilus come down from Malchus, but then from Malchus it needs to go down through the different worlds of Pri, Yetzirah, Asiyah. And in those different worlds, there could be sometimes hiccups. There could be a transitioning delay that be able to come down from Chesed of Atzilus, Malchus into Chesed Bria, then from Chesed Bria into Chesed Yetzirah, and so on until it comes down into the physical world, and not just come down into the physical world. The physical world, it could be physicality, it could be literal physicality, or it could be spiritual things. But to be able to come down to the physical world and physical needs, that is necessary for the davening every day to ensure and to make sure that it comes down all the way. So yesterday at the end, in Nice Dalit, we asked, seemingly, isn't that also included in the Rosh Hashanah davening? Isn't that explicit that on Rosh Hashanah we're davening for the physical, we're not davening for the material, for the spiritual? And we see it also in the expressions in davening, and the language used, that on Rosh Hashanah we are asking literally for physical life and everything else that we need in the physical sense. So why is it necessary for it to go through again that whole Seder Ishtalshlos of the going from Bri, Yetzirah, Asiyah, and so on, to be able to come down into this physical world? It was already determined that. So we can continue now in Ois Hey, page 10, fourth page of the mind, line 12. According to what the Alter Rebbe explains in the Siddur, filed Mamar Alter Rebbe by the Mittler Rebbe, called Siddur of Dak, Pasuk Yom Yom Abiyah Omer, Shabbos morning davening. So on the Pasuk Yom Yom Abiyah Omer, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer brought down the Siddur. It says, during the weekday, Yeshnam Kami Kuvim Amshach Sashpa Lamat. There's many delays and obstacles in drawing down the Ashpa down here below. Yom Shabbos, but on Shabbos, Amshachas Hashpa Yibirus. The drawing down of the Ashpa is with speed. Yabia, the Alter Rebbe explains, doesn't just mean, giving over, but it means, I think he's trying to say from the word nevia, like a flow. Yabia Loshen Mihirus, he brings it from the Zoya, the Torah. That means Yabia means that it comes down, Omer, what he commanded, what he said it should be, comes down in a way of speed. Before Shabbos explained over there, the reason why during the weekday it's possible that what comes down should be delayed and should not come down below. For example, like a person that considers and judges something in his mind, in his intellect, if it's appropriate, if it's worthy to do it or not. All comes to a decision, comes to a resolution. Yes, this should be done. It's appropriate. It's okay. It's good. Became still and all. This could remain all theoretical. Actually, the short, but still like beat that is to remain only in his intellect. Will not come down in action. So he was thinking about action, he wasn't thinking about anything spiritual. But yet, it remained theoretical in his mind. Satan is even more so when this could be like he's thinking about something that could take place in a week in advance. Now, when the actual crunch time comes, it actually comes now. He doesn't just say, well, a week ago I was thinking about it and I figured it out. That's a good thing. No. Now when it's actually coming to the actual need to put this into action, it says, then he reconsiders again. It says in line 23, matters in actuality. He considers it in his mind again. Him losses of to do it in actuality the way he decided in his intellect. Though his decision in his intellect was that it makes sense to do it. So he had this decision, whatever it is, a week ago, and he said, it makes sense. They call him up and still and all. Even what type of action was felt when he came up with the conclusion to do this action? It's action the way it lives in the mind, the way it lives in the intellect. Therefore, it's not real. It doesn't strike him as being, this is reality, this is something that we actually have to do. Therefore, Shabbat, the top of page Yud, when it actually is arriving at actually doing this, that this is something that has to be done, action the way it stands on its own, not just something in his intellect, not just something theoretical. Nifrit ma'aseichel, separated from the intellect. He needs to consult and he needs to make a judgment in his mind again. Losses came to poil if to do it in actuality. So the Rebbe breaks this down. What is actually the process that's going on over here? What's actually the problems or the delays that are going on? So the Rebbe is going to break it down to two aspects, two components. It says in line 3, but Proteus, more specifically, Shnei Yom, that there are two aspects and components to this. The fact that the Seichel came to the decision, came to the conclusion that this is something that's worthy to do. It's not something that obligates the action. Since the action, the way it's living in the world of intellect, the way intellect contains action in it, versus actual action as something separate, these are two separate worlds. So the fact that the action that lives in my intellect, we say this action is worthwhile, it doesn't relate and it doesn't connect with a physical act. Therefore, it's possible that even though he decided whenever it was that this is an appropriate course of action, still not going to bring the person to do the action. He doesn't even think about it in an action. In other words, yes, I filed it away. I thought about it, makes sense. And now I filed it away. I'm not thinking about it and imagining and picturing, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Then another aspect and component of this is line 10. Even when he thinks about this, there's possible that he's going to have a reason not to do it. In other words, when push comes to shove, when it actually comes to performing the action, so that he can have all of a sudden a counter opinion, even though beforehand he discussed it in his mind, he considered it in his mind, and then he came to the resolution. But when it's actually coming to action, he can come up with an opposite opinion, an opposite viewpoint, not to do it, but sort of and therefore you need to judge it again. So there's two components, they said. One thing is that the action wasn't real the way it was in his mind. Another component is that when it actually comes to doing the action, so then it's going to need reconsideration because it can pop into his head an opposite svara, some other way of looking at this concept. Now, this is in general from intellect to the world of action. And that's going to be the general explanation for how it needs to translate from Malchus to Atzilus, where it was already established on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur that the person would get certain things in this world, to actually become transmitted into the physical world down here throughout the year. But we know we said there are stages. There's Malchus Datzilus bringing down this idea into Chesed Bria, and that from Chesed Bria it has to be Slavish or Chesed Yitzira, etc., till it comes down to Chesed in this physical world. So the Rebbe is going to explain how this type of re-examination and reviewing of things need to express itself over all the three worlds. That in the person, the three worlds is machshava dibur ma'aseh. So it's not just a jump between intellect and action, but from intellect to action, the intellect has to come into thought, and the thought has to come into speech, and the speech has to come into action. And therefore, every single stage that I was going to explain is another process of reconsideration and reevaluation. And that's why there needs to be the consideration that comes from Malchus Tatzilus to Chesed Bria, the Chesed Bria to Chesed Yitzira. Just like by a person, there's the reevaluation from the intellect when it has to come to thought, and from the thought when it has to come to speech, and from the speech when it has to come into action. That's what he's going to explain right now. Line 13, second paragraph on page U. Hine HaSeder Shloshel of which I'm official, the order of these three garments of the soul. Shava Dibra Maisa, thought, speech, and deed. Why the machshav, but they were able to be drawn down from the intellect. Or sometimes an action activity is triggered motivated by emotion. So it's sometimes the emotion that has to cause it to come down into action, but it doesn't go directly into action. Whether it's intellect or the emotions, it must first go through thought and speech. What type of thought are we referring to? That through that thought, it will eventually be transmitted into the speech, and from there into action, is that he's thinking how to do it. In other words, there's machshava, which is completely bottled to the intellect. That is the original machshava that he used when his intellect was thinking, considering, is this a good thing to do or not? That machshava was present right away, to be able to consider anything with his intellect, not for emotions, but whether it's intellect or emotions, he needs to put it in his thought. That's not the thought that we're talking about over here. That's another stage. That goes hand in hand together with the intellectual decision that he did to accept and to resolve and to come to the conclusion that this is a good course of action. There's another phase of thought. There's another component of thought, which is in a way separate from the intellect that came to the decision to do it. That other stage of thought, which is separate from the intellect, which came about to do it, is the thought about how am I going to bring this into action. It's thinking already in the action perspective. It's not a thought that's about completely in service and bottled to the intellect that he came to the conclusion to do it, but it's already a thought related to the world of action. Okay, we got to act on it. Now let me think about it. How are we going to bring it into fruition? So this differentiation of the two levels of machshava is going to talk about now in the brackets. Line 19, or right before line 18. Since this thought, this lower stage of thought, where he's considering how to do it, is lower or separated than the intellect. It's not the thought that originally was there when he was coming to the resolution and he concluded to do it. So he says in the brackets, when he first initially was judging the matter and deciding Okay, I guess I need to start over from where? Line 18? Again, line 18, line 19. So again, he's talking about that the thought that he had originally is not the thought that we're talking about now, that he has to take the intellect and stick it into the thought. So the bracket starts saying, the thought that was there initially, when he was judging in his intellect, so he decided that he has to do it, or it's an appropriate course of action. Was nullified to the intellect, it was nullified to the consideration that the intellect gave and to his decision. That initial thought is that through it, the intellect is felt. And this is something that the person is aware of, the intellect through the thought. So, but in that higher stage of thought, there's no separation between the thought and the intellect. As opposed to the thought about how to do it, is a separate entity, completely distinct from intellect, and that is a further stage, the thought about how to do it. And therefore, since it's a further stage, the point is, so we need to take the intellect and transmit it into that further stage. It says in the end of line 24, that drawing it down from the initial decision that the intellect decided that this is an appropriate course of action, to the next stage, to the thought about how am I going to do this, the idea equal. It goes through a delay process. And this is Bishnei and Yonim Haniskodim in the two types of delays that we mentioned at the end of the previous paragraph. One delay, one type of processing it has to go through is the fact that the person decided intellectually, theoretically, that this is a worthy course of action, so it doesn't obligate the person, it doesn't force the person to start thinking about, so how am I going to actually do this? It can remain theoretical. Yes, it's a worthy course of action, and he never follows up. So what am I doing about it? How am I going to go about this? That's one aspect of the delay and the processing that's between the decision that this is a correct course of action and the thought about how to do it. Another component is line 28. The Yisraelim is even more so. Be able to draw this down from the intellect into thought. That now he's going to go from the process where he decided in his intellect this is a worthy course of action. Now he's going to think, how am I going to put this action into action? So he's going to reconsider it again. Yeah, am I really going to do this? I'm really considering putting it into action. Let me reconsider this again. Those are two steps of delay and processing between the decision in the intellect and the thought process concerning about how to put it into action. Just like there are these two stages in the transmission and the processing from the intellectual decision to the level of thought about how to go about and do it, what we're going to speak about in a similar vein. There's a speech and an action. It says in line 29, last line on the page, in a similar vein is that comes from thought, the speech, top of page Yudal. Since the speech is lower than thought, the thought is internal. It's for the person themselves. It's not meant to be shared with outside. And speech is for another. It's meant to communicate whatever he has in his mind, in his intellect, in his emotions outside. Therefore, so that further drawing down, the further processing of going to thought, which is something private, to going public with it, So that going from the private stage to the public stage is also the idea. Ikub also goes through a process, through a delay. Also, in this going from the private to the public is in the two components that we mentioned before. The fact that internally he thought to himself how to go about doing this particular action that he decided that it's a good course of action doesn't mean that he'll go public with it. It's possible that the thing could remain in his thought, and he won't even consider if to speak about it. Then, it says in line 8, you say to him is even more social. Concerning speech. Even when it's already moving down lower, and he's considering whether he should speak or not. Yes, so now there's a doubt. He still has to seek his own counsel, and he has to judge this again. How come? Why he doesn't need to examine this again? The key, since thought is personal, internal, and speech is public and outward. Therefore, even after he came to the decision in his thought, he's still in doubt whether to bring this also in speech. Legal to reveal it to another. In a similar vein is when it comes down from speech to action. Since the action is even more separated from speech, it's even a greater distance from the person, it's more outward. Therefore, the drawing down from speech to action is through a delay, through processing. The two components and aspects that we mentioned before. The speech does not obligate, does not force one to come to the conclusion to do this particular action. And as we see, people speak a good game, and they'll say about how great it is to do this particular thing, and they might even say that they're going to do this particular thing, but it doesn't actually come out in practical action. Say, to draw it down from speech into action, he needs to seek counsel within himself, he needs to judge this again. According to what it's known, that thought and speech are more closely related than action is related to the other two. The very same words and language about a certain thing that were initially in his thought afterwards come out in the speech. So speech and action and thought are very closely related. As opposed to action, that's something completely and distinctly separated. We could say delay in drawing down from speech to action concerning the two aspects and components that we spoke about before, that there needs to be a delay of two processes to even bring it down to action, and then to reconsider and to judge, is the action worthy? Therefore, since action is so far from thought and speech, it's an even greater delay and greater process than the delay in the processing and drawing down from speech to action.